specifically looking at these connections between progressivism as an idea and a lot of the things that came along with it that we've discussed somewhat before. Labor unions, for example, trying to help working people and working people's vision of themselves, and then ultimately what we see in terms of war. And what I want to do is start with a story about this Bisbee deportation, as it's called, and sort of see if we can make some of these connections here. Bisbee is a town in Arizona, or was a town in Arizona, where some events occur during really leading up to the period of World War I that I think illustrate a lot of the connections here between, say, progressivism, labor activism, immigration, and ultimately the sort of ultra-nationalism that is, often, associated with war. Obviously, patriotism is really at an all-time high when you move into a war, right? We talked about that when we talked about a badging community way back when. So Bisbee, Arizona, I think is a good example, to go through to illustrate some of these connections and draw out some of the examples that you saw in the video. And we'll see in chapter 19, which covers World War I. There are labor struggles happening in Arizona, and this is the West, right? So in some respects, it brings up this whole notion of the region of the West that we raised before, too, and developments there, industrialization and other things that are happening in the West, just like they're happening in the North, and just like, to some extent, they're happening in the South as well. This is going to happen, though, against the backdrop of World War I, right, where all of a sudden it's very important to be super patriotic, right? When your nation is at war. To question your nation in any way, or to question those in charge of the nation, might be seen as unpatriotic or un-American by some. Right? So we notice in times of war, in times of national crisis, there are often these issues that arise. The Bisbee deportation is going to be one of these examples. What ultimately happens is that vigilantes, people that take the law into their own hands, are going to become active in Bisbee, Arizona. They're acting on behalf of the leading businessmen in Bisbee. So there's this class, I don't want to say class warfare, but it gets close to that essentially in Bisbee, Arizona. Right? These vigilantes will act on behalf of some of the leading businessmen, and they will try to crush a bitter labor strike that's happening in Arizona. These workers, especially in the period moving up, leading to World War I, start to sort of feel their power as workers. Right? They start to look at themselves as kind of an imagined community of workers. And what better moment to threaten a strike for better pay, for better hours, better working conditions, safer conditions. What better time to do that than when your production is at an all-time high because of the war? Right? The U.S. is producing, even before we joined the war, we're producing war materials, especially for the Allies. So there's this moment when production is really needed, and these workers are like, wait a second, we're working harder than ever, right? Yet our conditions are still unsafe, our wages are still not good. Why not take this moment and use this sort of moment of opportunity? But again, for some, this might be seen as unpatriotic, as kind of undermining the war effort. So it's a dangerous gamble in some ways, but a very calculated one. But it's going to lead to a specific reaction in Bisbee, Arizona, and in some other places like Bisbee. So these vigilantes will act on behalf of the businessmen, and they want to crush this labor strike. They want to crush these workers really before they can win. Right? This labor strike is sort of crippling the copper industry in the West. Right? A lot of copper and other metals are being mined in the West, and so mining in particular is a major Western industry. What do these vigilantes do? Well, they literally will take and seize miners in their homes. Right? They go and get them, and laugh. It just seems so extreme in some levels. They seize miners in their homes and on the street, and are going to force them back to work. So these workers are like, we're not going to work. We're striking. We're essentially stealing our labor, right? But these vigilantes say, oh, no, you're going to go to work. Right? So they literally are trying to force them. Any miner that refused to go back to work was taken downtown to a sort of plaza in downtown Bisbee at gunpoint. Right? So they're taken at gunpoint downtown and ultimately taken to a local baseball park. Right? So they're gathered up, kind of herded into this baseball park. They're given one last chance at this point at gunpoint. Right? They're given one last chance to return to work. And those that refuse, I think it's about 1,400 of them, were forced onto a freight train car. They're put onto a train car, 1,400 of them. And they're taken about 170 miles to the east on this train car because they're refusing to work. They literally are going to be removed from the society, removed from the imagined community, if you want to look at it that way. To Columbus, New Mexico. They're dropped off in the desert, essentially, in Columbus, New Mexico. And this is what we're referred to as the Bisbee deportation. So again, you see the kind of extremes that folks are going to, even before the U.S. is really officially involved in the war. Right? These tensions around patriotism and economic, labor activism are really particularly strong. Many of them will have racial and ethnic overtones. And think about the millions of new immigrants that are streaming into the United States, many of whom are going to be among the lowest skilled workers, right? Those most in need of a raise, those that, if they can be organized by groups like the IWW or the Wobblies, might be willing to strike for better conditions. So sometimes they're seen, these things might be interpreted in terms of ethnicity and race as well. But this Bisbee deportation is an interesting kind of snapshot on a lot of things, right, leading to World War I. It makes us think about the historical context. It makes us think about what's happening in the country and what's happening in the world in this period. It occurs against a complicated backdrop in some ways. The U.S. had really just entered the war, officially just entered the war. Corporations are going to try to take advantage of this. And corporations, I think about the robber barons that we spent a lot of time talking about a few weeks ago. This is a moment of possible profit. So it's a moment when sort of patriotism or supporting the Allies may align with capitalism, making a profit. This is seen as a good opportunity for this. So these corporations may try to take advantage of this situation and increase their profits, producing more and more for the war effort, producing more than before for the war effort. And again, labor and active unions are also going to try to improve their position. What better opportunity to do this than to show your patriotism by working, but also being what you consider fairly compensated for your work. Working in safe conditions, these sorts of things. In essence, it's workers kind of feeling their power. They're not just individuals, they're feeling themselves as a group, and they believe that they have rights. They're asserting their rights. Several communities will experience vigilantism during World War I. We talked about some of this way back when we talked about lynching. Right? A lot of those lynchings that we looked at happened during or right after World War I. And so it's interesting to think about that as the U.S. is fighting to make the world safe for democracy. Some of that democracy is in question here at various moments. You can think about this in terms of patriotism and imagined community. You can think about this as a moment of a tipping point as well. Maybe make some sense of this. Any behavior deemed unpatriotic might get a violent reaction because it's deemed unpatriotic at a moment of sort of hyper-patriotism in a sense. Especially in places like the West, seen as kind of less developed, less organized in certain senses. Vigilantes have long operated in this West, and some of the reasons that they gave was that there wasn't a strong enough police force to enforce the law and these sorts of things, so they're going to take the law into their own hands. We saw a lot of this around the gold rush in places like California, for example, where horse thieves and claim jumpers and such might be dealt with by the community. So this notion of vigilantism is an interesting one to look at, particularly in a place like the West. We looked at it in the South as well. This ultra-patriotic moment, though, can also be used to crack down on a number of groups seen as problematic. So labor unions might be attacked with this. Certain racial minorities might be attacked with this. Anarchists, those are in favor of no government, or peace activists even. It's interesting how peace activists might even be seen as unpatriotic. If you are arguing against the war, even if it's for reasons of peace, you don't believe in war as an idea, it still might land you into some trouble with certain groups. So this is going to be an interesting kind of moment. Politically, right, both parties are really going to try to align themselves with American ideals and argue that the other party is being unpatriotic as well. So we can think about the politics of this. We can think about the economics of it. We can think about race, gender, a number of other factors that might come into this region as well. In Bisbee, Arizona, there's a couple of big corporations. One in particular was the giant Phelps Dodge Company. The Phelps Dodge Company would dominate the political and the social life of Bisbee, Arizona. Now, this might vary from different cities, right? You might have different corporations that are dominating, but in Bisbee, it's the Phelps Dodge Company that dominates. For example, they own the hospital. The Phelps Dodge Company, this big corporation, owns the hospital. They own the department store, libraries. They might own your house. It might be company housing in many respects. So think about how, in some ways, you're tied to this company, and questioning that company can get you into some trouble. And there are some tensions as the society is changing, as progress is working its way into Bisbee like it's working its way everywhere else. New technologies are being introduced that are going to raise some questions. New technologies after 1900, for example, might come in and make it necessary to hire less workers. New immigrants coming in, especially Southern and Eastern Europeans, Slavic workers, Italian workers, Czechs, Mexican labor in the West in particular. What happens when these workers are seen as un-American, when they're seen as threatening, perhaps to the workers that might already be there, right, as replacing quote-unquote American or more skilled labor. Right? So these tensions might operate on a number of different levels. So English-born miners might find themselves struggling with non-American-born workers. All of this is happening against the backdrop of World War I, and sort of global tensions, and also economic tensions. World War I will push the price of copper to an all-time high. The Phelps Dodge Company is mining copper, so the stakes are really high, economically speaking, on top of everything else. The Phelps Dodge Company wants to produce more. They want to make more profit, and so they're going to push for more production. More production means more profits as far as they're concerned. And who knows how long the war will even last. So strike while the iron is hot, essentially. And these miners are going to, like I said before, look at this as an opportunity to improve their own conditions, that they want to strike while the iron is hot as well. There are two unions, two local unions operating in the city. One is affiliated with the IWW, or the Wobblies. Talked about them a few weeks ago. They're seen as more radical. They might be willing to organize new immigrants, for example, even African Americans in some areas. So the IWW on one hand, and the AFL on the other hand, the American Federation of Labor, who we talked about as well, seen as more of a mainstream union. They wanted to unionize skilled labor. They wanted to unionize men for the family wage and all of that, like we talked about. So they're two unions. They're both unions, but their vision is different about their activism and how to achieve greater worker power, greater workers' rights. So there are two rival union locals, one affiliated with each of the national groups. In 1917, around June 1917, the Wobblies in Bisbee would go on strike. The IWW, the more radical in the minds of many, go on strike. They demanded things like better mine safety. That the mines were essentially dangerous, and improve the safety of these mines. An end to discrimination against union workers, and a pay increase. And so they're asking for things that might be seen as radical at that particular moment. The walkout was a peaceful one. Right? They're not threatening violence at this point, but the company is unwilling to compromise with them. They've walked out. They've essentially removed their labor, and this is going to be seen as a threat. Now, early on, the town is sort of supportive of these workers. I think partially because they maybe frame their arguments in ways that seem very American, that seem less radical than they're going to seem later on. They may have wanted the same thing a year later, but it seems more radical based on the context, perhaps. Right? So despite early town support for the strike, the strikers ultimately are going to be characterized or labeled as unpatriotic. Right? The things that they're asking for are going to be seen as unpatriotic. They're seen as dangerous radicals. Right? Once they're unpatriotic, they're seen as dangerous radicals, and these vigilantes sent to get them are going to be members of what was called the Bisbee Citizens Protective League. Citizens Protective League. And also the Workers' Loyalty League. Again, you can just look at the name of those organizations and get some sense of imagined community. Citizens Protective League, right? You're protecting the rights of citizens by essentially grabbing these radical workers. Think imagined community. They're thinking of themselves as the true Americans as opposed to these workers that are fighting for what they think makes them the true Americans. Now, the IWW, the Wobblies had made a special effort to attract lower paid foreign-born workers. So again, some of this may be seen in terms of ethnicity or even racially. Workers, new immigrants that are still seen as other, maybe more quickly seen as unpatriotic or un-American. So perhaps that plays into this in some way as well. The participants, or the vigilantes, as you might label them that way, defended themselves by exaggerating the threat of organized labor. They exaggerate the threat of these workers that are walking out. They would appeal specifically to notions of patriotism, notions of sort of loyalty to your nation in time of war. And they would also play on racial fears, in particular the sort of anti-Mexican sentiment that often characterized the West. So all these things are enough to sort of whip up hysteria and change, remove the support, I guess you could say, for the workers. The IWW as a union also opposed American involvement in the war. The union itself officially opposed American involvement in the war, making it vulnerable to charges of disloyalty. This made them vulnerable to charges of disloyalty. Again, if you think about sort of Marxist ideology, right, this notion that workers have something in common across national borders, we talked about this way back when with Imagined Community, right, that a worker in Pittsburgh has something in common with a steel worker in the Soviet Union. According to Marx, it's an international movement of workers. Then it might make sense that a union might be against war, right? A nation's going to war is not good for workers on any side. So maybe it makes some sense philosophically, at least, to understand that, right? That they want to get beyond nationalism and think internationally. But once you're in your nation, this could be seen as a problem for reasons that don't need explanation. Right? You seem disloyal. You seem unpatriotic. Even if you're arguing for peace. Even a number of people that are arguing for peace at all costs, that refuse to fight in any war, might be seen as disloyal in that sense. Think even later, right? Think 1960, Cassius Clay / Muhammad Ali, right? Does not participate in the Vietnam War. He's seen as immediately unpatriotic because the U.S. is at war at that moment. So even peace itself might be questioned as politically problematic. A census taken of the deported workers in Bisbee. They take a census of them. This census shows that they are overwhelmingly loyal. More than 1/3 had already registered for the draft, despite the fact that the National Union had come out for peace. More than 1/3 had already registered for the draft, even as the U.S. is entering the war. Many had purchased Liberty bonds and other very patriotic sort of economic moves to demonstrate your patriotism. But these miners still will find it very difficult to overcome charges or accusations that they're disloyal. It didn't matter if you actually were loyal. It mattered if you appeared loyal. It mattered if the larger community thought that you were loyal or not. They're coming to be seen as anti-American and foreign-inspired, particularly communist-inspired, as we'll see after the Communist Revolution in Russia and the sort of Red Scare that will come during and after the First World War. The presidential committee that will become involved in this, because ultimately it goes all the way up to the White House. The president has to sort of get involved. They would criticize, the presidential committee initially criticizes the mine companies as treating these workers unfairly. And so the committee set up by the president initially criticizes the mine companies and declares the deportation illegal. It's essentially a violation of their citizenship rights. But it also denied that the federal government had any jurisdiction over the matter. And so generally they're saying this seems, that the mine company was in the wrong, but they also say, you know what, we don't really have jurisdiction. We can't really intervene. We can think of this in terms of the whole federal government versus state government battles that we've talked about already a number of times. Confederate flag issue, we talked about Civil War itself. A lot of this is going to have to do with federal power versus state power, which has always been this kind of difficult question in American history. Still is. It still is. To what extent does the federal government have authority? To what extent do the state governments have authority? So you can smoke weed in Colorado, but not in Arizona. Right? These sorts of things are still unresolved, let's say. States' rights versus federal rights. The events convinced President Woodrow Wilson, you saw, that the IWW itself, that this union itself was a subversive organization, right, and a threat to the national security. And the Justice Department would kind of put the IWW on its radar. They would start to pay more attention to this particular union, and some would decide that they wanted to really undermine the IWW, the Wobblies, if at all possible. They would begin an all-out legal assault that would soon cripple the Wobblies. As a result, Arizona's mines would remain union-free, at least until the New Deal in the 1930s after the Great Depression. So this sort of undermining of that union is really going to mean that the unions will remain without, the mines will remain without unions until at least the Great Depression. Again, think about the Depression, another economic challenge in this country, the biggest in history, right, where a lot of folks start to question whether capitalism itself is collapsing. Right? This is the moment when the unions sort of take hold there, but not in this earlier moment. So what's the significance of all this? What are some of the implications of this? These labor struggles in Bisbee, Arizona reflect the tensions of a nation at war. They show some of the complications of nations at war, not just in terms of their battle with other nations, but their battle internally, sort of domestic issues. Are there current parallels? I think about, for example, a war on terror. Does that impact domestic issues? I think most people would say yes. In some ways, it's going to complicate things here at home as well. Right, these labor shortages, the increase in wartime production on some level will help workers because it gives them more leverage, right? But wartime patriotism would allow businesses and more conservative groups to also attack labor and attack labor unions, kind of telling them to put their grievances to the side and just produce for the war effort, and then maybe come back to those grievances after the war to maybe argue for a more gradual approach to change. Most progressive activists will turn their attention away from domestic issues, right? So these progressives now have their attention shifted to the war. Most of them are going to have their attention shifted away from reform at home and towards the job of mobilizing their society for war. Right? You got to win the war first, many are going to say, before you deal with these issues at home. If you don't win the war, then there may not be any home to defend or to reform. So war often changes the priorities of a number of activists. Yet some long-time or long-term progressive causes like women's suffrage and like prohibition will actually achieve success in this period. Prohibition goes into effect in 1918, I think, and women's suffrage, the 19th Amendment, is going to be passed and ultimately ratified in 1919, 1920, right after the war. So some of these progressive causes that have a longer history will succeed, in part because of the war, you might say. Some say they're wartime necessities. Are you going to fight to make the world safe for democracy? And then millions of women say, well, wait, what about home? We can't vote yet. What about democracy at home? So there's a moment there, perhaps, where these activists might be able to use this moment to their advantage. A booming economy will also attract millions of African Americans from the South to the North and West, and this is going to be known as the Great Migration. We'll look at that in some more detail because it's going to change the way a number of cities look, a number of American cities look. Between 1910 and 1970, about 6 million African Americans will leave the South and come to the North and West, particularly as a result of World War I and World War II. So we'll look at some of that a little bit later. Although the U.S. only spent about a year and a half in the fighting, the Great War would help transform American society. We saw some of that in the video. Even though we joined and then it takes a while to mobilize and we really reach the battlefield fairly late compared to some of the other nations, it is in time. It is going to be a decisive to the victory in some ways. We would fight for about 8 months once we sort of land. But that 8 months is an important one. Puts us on the winning side, helps win the war. We enter the war at the same moment that Russia is leaving the war because of its own communist revolution. So there's it's an important tipping point in 1917, 1918 when that happens. It's going to make the U.S. a world power. We are becoming a world power in this period. And that has a number of implications for the U.S., its economy, its foreign policy, its view of itself. In some ways, the U.S. may become more aggressive in its foreign policy. It might become more aggressive as we start to feel our power, start to feel ourselves as a great power. The presidents in this period, Teddy Roosevelt, who you saw, William Howard Taft, Woodrow Wilson, who you saw, all contributed to what they called a progressive diplomacy. Progressive diplomacy. So take progressivism at home and extend it abroad. What does progressivism look like when it's extended? Right? And for some, this is going to mean commercial expansion, the expansion of business. The U.S. Expanding into markets abroad in order, again, to help the nation and the national economy here at home. This may be paired with a growing military presence around the world, and especially close to home, for example, in the Caribbean. We're going to take a special interest in the Caribbean, Latin America, those areas closest to home, and really sort of demand that Europe kind of leave, quote unquote, our backyard alone, and we say we'll leave their backyard alone, sort of an extension of the Monroe Doctrine. And now we feel like we have the power, the capability, military capability of sort of fulfilling that perceived threat. Teddy Roosevelt's a great example of this, right? Teddy Roosevelt talked about speaking softly but carrying a big stick. So increasing the power of the military, having a presence, a naval presence further and further abroad, right? To sort of increase Americans' international visibility, to increase our stature, and to really sort of demand respect among the great nations of Europe. We feel like we are able to do so now, and that we should do so. That we have not only a right to do so, but a responsibility. Right? This notion of sort of manifest destiny, American exceptionalism, these terms that we've looked at previously. So speak softly and carry a big stick. That's the phrase associated with Teddy Roosevelt, who considers himself progressive. He is heavily considered progressive. He's going to specifically apply this to the Caribbean and to things like the building of the Panama Canal. The building of the Panama Canal. Since the 1860s, a number of nations have wanted to try to build a canal, but it becomes a top priority for Teddy Roosevelt in terms of national defense, in terms of facilitating trade, world trade. He takes it on as symbolically important and as practically important. You could cut travel distances, you could cut the time needed to get goods and services from east to west by building this canal. It becomes a top priority for TR, and he would start to negotiate with Colombia in order to do so. Negotiate with the nation of Colombia to do so. When Colombia rejects the final U.S. offer, though, in 1903, the U.S. would help fuel a revolt against Colombia by Panama. Panama, in some ways, helping that will get the U.S. rights to land to build this canal. So it's interesting the way politics, global politics, and obviously global economics are going to come into this as well. U.S. warships would move into the region to support Panamanian independence and would sign treaties with them so that after the revolt, we have access to this land. The U.S. is given full sovereignty over a 10-mile wide strip of land. The going to be a canal zone to build the canal. The Panama Canal would open in 1914, the same year that the Great War begins in Europe. And it's seen as a major technological accomplishment, literally kind of conquering nature, essentially, right? You're digging a canal through the earth. Gives the U.S. a major strategic and economic advantage. It increases our visibility, our stature, our power, economic mobility. It took 8 years to build. It was a very difficult undertaking. If you've seen any documentaries of the building of the canal, it takes a long time. It's very dangerous work. There are workers that die in this. It would cost hundreds of poorly paid manual laborers their lives. I had a grandfather, in fact, that worked on the Panama Canal. So it's a difficult undertaking, but it's one that's successful in the eyes of the United States. Once you build the canal, though, some say, well, this requires a greater American presence in the region to now defend the canal, to make sure that it's not taken from them. Once you spent all that money and all that time building it, you're not going to sort of abandon it. So again, this becomes a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. There's a greater American presence abroad, and then you need a greater presence in order to defend the foothold that the United States has established. It's also used to support an open door policy, as it was called, in Asia. This attempt to sort of open up Asian markets, China and elsewhere, to American goods and to goods from the West. Traditionally closed societies, you want to sort of pry them open for economic reasons in part. President Taft is also seen as a progressive, but much of his progressivism will proceed through economics, right? Opening up these markets economically, not necessarily as militaristically as Roosevelt had in mind. He believed he could replace the militarism of this big stick with a more subtle weapon of kind of business and investment. So the dollar, right? The dollar diplomacy is what he often called it. What we're going to see is greater economic investment of the United States and other nations. A greater economic investment in other nations. Now, of course, once you have invested dollars in other nations, you sort of feel like you need to watch those dollars. You need to secure and defend those dollars. So greater economic investment in other parts of the world may lead to greater political involvement in other parts of the world as well, despite the fact that, again, going back to George Washington, the notion was that the U.S. should stay out of foreign affairs, foreign entanglements. Well, what happens in the 20th century when economic imperatives may push the U.S. Away from that? Overall, U.S. investment in Central America would more than double between 1908 and 1914, from about 40 million to over 90 million in a 6-year period. So a dramatic increase in what Taft called dollar diplomacy. Again, this diplomacy, dollar diplomacy, though, also required greater military support. Ultimately, attempts to increase American presence in China would make nations like Japan nervous. Japan had its own designs on dominating Asia, and so this is going to really kind of begin a rivalry between the United States and Japan that ultimately is going to culminate in World War II. It takes a while. It starts to simmer perhaps in this period, but ultimately it's going to lead to war, many say, 30 years later. Wilson. Right? Wilson really wants to avoid all of this foreign stuff. He wants to focus on his domestic agenda, but as we're going to see, he's not ultimately going to be successful in doing that. Really, he's pulled into war against his will, essentially, and that's going to really derail his progressive program at home. He had come into office in 1913. He wins re-election in 1916, literally running on the campaign slogan, "I kept us out of the war." This is what he runs on and wins in 1916. But then a year later, the U.S. will find itself in the war, particularly because of events with Germany that you saw, unrestricted submarine warfare, the sort of threat of allying with Mexico and trying to get Mexico to invade the U.S., right, offering them several states back that they had lost in the Mexican-American War the previous century. So these things bring us into the conflict, the sinking of the Lusitania, as you saw. So it really probably was, Wilson's hands were probably tied in terms of this. It does derail, though, much of his agenda, much of his desires. Yet the Great War itself greatly affects an entire generation. We sort of see some of that in the video here, right? It sort of impacted an entire world generation. Obviously, we're most interested in Americans, but it really impacts the entire world. At the start of the war in August 1914, both sides feel like it's going to be a quick victory. You actually had soldiers marching off to war in parades on both sides. Both sides were really happy to go to war. In this moment, this was one of those times in world history where war was seen as not just a good thing, but really a way of proving your national power. It was almost a kind of manly thing. Right? You're going to go off and fight and whip those Germans and come back. People are writing home to their loved ones saying, okay, I'm marching off in August. I'll be home by Christmas. There's countless soldiers saying, oh, yeah, this will be a quick 3-month kind of thing. We'll go over there. We'll whip those Krauts real quick. Quite often, this is how they refer to them. And we'll be back for Christmas. Now, that's not going to be, well, it's going to be true Christmas 4 years later. They'll be back, right? Those that don't die. But the world has changed. And in part, it's changed because of the technologies. This is not the same sort of warfare that folks had become accustomed to. Think about the new technologies that are going to be implemented in this war. The machine gun. Right? All of a sudden now, it's not just about bravery. Your commanding officer tells you to run 1,000 yards at that machine gun nest, and wave after wave are just cut down. It's not about bravery anymore. The tactics have changed even before folks have realized it. Poison gas, trenches, tanks. It's a different style of warfare, and stalemate is going to occur pretty quickly here. Over 2.5 years, 5 million people would die. And between 8 and 10 million would die over the entire conflict. This is going to shock Europe in particular. It's going to shock Americans as well that would encounter it. Wilson's initial push for neutrality obviously can't be maintained. And we're ultimately going to find ourselves involved in the conflict. Now, part of the reason why neutrality was probably the best course early on is think about the United States. The United States is a land of hyphenated Americans. It's a land of immigrants. There are millions of immigrants here from Germany, billions of immigrants here from France, billions of immigrants here from Italy, billions of immigrants here from, obviously, England. It used to be an English colony. So which side are we going to fight on? Right? Some of those immigrants in the early years are sending money home to their home nations. So they're German Americans sending checks home to Germany to fight the war early on before the U.S. gets involved. Now, once we get involved, that's going to stop. Right? These new Americans will quickly ally themselves with their new nation. But think about how complicated it would be for a president to say, okay, this is the enemy, despite the fact that millions of people in this country may have just immigrated from that nation. So the fact that this is a land of immigrants may have been one of the complicating factors. I'll give you a statistic. In 1914, the total U.S. population was 92 million. 92 million. 33% of them, so 1 out of 3, were hyphenated Americans. Hyphenated Americans, either foreign-born or having one or both parents who were immigrants. So literally 1 out of 3 may have just immigrated. It can be very difficult, you would think, theoretically, to unite a nation for war behind those statistics. Early on, there was actually strong support for the Central Powers, particularly among German Americans, right, or the 4 million Irish Americans. Right? The Irish and the English have a long history of conflict. So many Irish Americans wouldn't have been thrilled about fighting to help Britain early on. Many of them had a hatred of British rule. So it really is going to play out over several years. And it's not until 1917, 1918 that the U.S. is fully involved in this conflict. Much of this other stuff you saw in the videos, I don't feel the need to go through a lot of that. The Lusitania, for example, unrestricted submarine warfare and other things. By 1916, Wilson has started to prepare the nation for war. So you start to see that movement towards war in even Wilson himself, who's trying to avoid war at all costs. And actually, he's called a coward by Teddy Roosevelt and others because of his failure to sort of jump once Germany started to do things that could have been considered acts of war. But by 1916, he's, I think, moving in that direction. Wilson is beginning to prepare the nation for war. For example, in June 1916, Congress passed the National Defense Act. National Defense Act. This would double the size of the regular army. Remember, the tradition in the United States is not to have a large standing army, and to have one of the smaller standing armies among larger nations, in fact. Why? It goes back to our early history. We were a colony. We didn't like having all those British troops here. So we stayed away from large standing armies. So the National Defense Act is meant to deal with that, to get the army moving in the right direction. It literally doubles the size of the regular army. And in August, Congress would increase defense spending tremendously. Even before, again, this is a year before we get involved, but it's in preparation for what seems like an inevitability. But there still was major opposition to the war for the reasons that we laid out, especially in the South, the Midwest. And Wilson wins re-election with the slogan, "He kept us out of the war." But by 1917, this is no longer going to be something that he can avoid, particularly after unlimited submarine warfare, after all these unarmed merchant ships are basically targeted, after civilians are killed, and other things, after the Zimmerman Note in particular. Wilson finally would ask for a declaration of war. He's going to ask for a declaration of war. But again, he argues that this is not just about American shipping rights. He wants to really cast this war as a moral crusade, as an extension of progressivism abroad. It's not just a war for economic rights. He's going to make that this idealistic language is particularly important in order to galvanize the American people behind this idea of war. He doesn't think the United States is really willing to fight a war for those limited ideas. Right? He says that America has a special mission as the Earth's most advanced nation. Think about American exceptionalism. We're unique. We have a role and a responsibility to spread democracy. And this is how he kind of sells the war to the American people. You definitely understand this in terms of American exceptionalism. Although the overall public response to Wilson's war message was pretty enthusiastic, right? People do begin to line up behind him. He still worries that common people would not support the war. He's very worried that common people would not support the war. So you see a number of mechanisms put in place on the domestic side, right, to sort of increase support for the war, right, to increase support for the war. I'll give you a couple of quick examples. Major ad campaigns would be used to sell the war. So some of the images you saw there, some of them characterize the Germans in negative ways, right? So sauerkraut is renamed Liberty Cabbage, right? Some high schools stopped teaching German. So it's really a kind of cultural war that's beginning. All things German were seen as negative, despite the fact that there are millions of German-American immigrants here, German immigrants here. Major ad campaigns. Think about how new technologies are being used to galvanize this imagined community, right, to get people behind the war. Movie stars would be asked to sort of speak out about the war, again, to galvanize popular journalists, artists, etc. The CPI, the Committee on Public Information, CPI, was created by Wilson only weeks after signing the Declaration of War. Only weeks later, the Committee on Public Information was formed. This led this increasingly aggressive kind of negative ad campaign against all things German. Posters and ads would depict Germans as uncivilized, sort of Huns. Right? Some atrocities were publicized, and some may have been exaggerated, but some do happen early on. And so this is broadcast back to the American people again to sort of galvanize folks behind the war effort. A lot of this is cultural. German music is seen as a negative thing. German literature, German language is banished from concert halls, schools, and libraries in many communities. Right, so once Germany is the enemy, German culture is also seen as the enemy. The CPI would urge ethnic Americans to abandon their old world ties, to sort of cut off their heritage, essentially, to quickly become American. I think about how this may relate to the whole Washington Du Bois debate, the debate between being both African and American at the same time. Remember, Washington was saying, cut the African off, be the best American you can be. That coincides in some respects, it even predates this. Washington's going to die in 1915, in fact. But the same thing will happen with these new immigrants to sort of push a more rapid assimilation. Abandon one's old world ties and become unhyphenated Americans as quickly as possible. These national campaigns, in some cases, might inspire local harassment. So then if you're seen as too German or too Central Powers in any way. German Americans, radicals of any type, peace activists, all might be seen as un-American. Right? You could tie this back to the whole Bisbee deportation we talked about. So by defining the war as a moral crusade, to kind of wrap this up, right? By defining the war as a moral crusade, President Wilson is able to win over many Americans that had previously been hesitant to go to war. He's able to really sort of galvanize them behind this powerful, powerful message. Fairly strong peace movement would slowly fade away. Many liberals and progressives began to think that the war could be really an opportunity to spread progressive ideals abroad. So they could still consider themselves progressives. It's just their field of activism had shifted from, say, the slums and urban areas to the battlefields in Europe. There are major challenges still to overcome in sort of mobilizing the nation for war. For example, what are some of these challenges? When war is declared, there are about 200,000, only about 200,000 men in the army. 200,000, a very small number compared to the nations of Europe. The U.S. now has to mobilize. How is it going to do so? Well, government is going to get involved. Right? The Selective Service Act was introduced. Selective Service Act. You young men know about this, right? You've got to sign off on selective service before you get things like financial aid. Essentially, you have to sign up to list yourself to be drafted if needed to support your nation. Right? This comes out of the World War I period. Provided for the registration and classification for military service of all men between the ages of 21 and 35. Now, of course, that's 18. To prevent the widespread opposition to the draft that had occurred a generation or two earlier with the Civil War, remember there were draft riots during the Civil War era, to try to avoid that, the new draft had no unpopular provision allowing draftees to buy their way out of service or for paying a substitute. Now remember, in the Civil War era, if you had the money, you could pay for a substitute. You could buy your way out. Some are saying, well, wait a second. That means that class allows you to kind of opt out of your patriotism. So the draft is supposed to be a more democratic way of providing the labor essentially needed for the war effort. On June 5th, 1917, 10 million men registered for the draft. 10 million. By the end of the war, 24 million had registered. So the army was 200,000. By the end of the war, you have 24 million men that had registered. And you saw General Pershing, that was appointed by Wilson as commander of the American Expeditionary Force. Pershing believes that American men need 6 months of training, that they're not ready for war, essentially. And the Germans themselves don't feel like we're going to be able to mobilize quickly enough to get soldiers trained, to get them shipped to the battlefield to make any difference. And again, technology wins out. We are able to get them trained, mobilized to the battlefield in time to make a decisive difference. But it's really not until early 1918 that Americans will reach the front in large numbers. 8 months later, the war is over. 8 months later, the war is over, but really kind of in the nick of time. In all, more than 52,000 Americans will die in battle in World War I. As compared to 620,000 or so in the Civil War. So relatively speaking, it's far less destructive for the U.S. Another 60,000 would die from influenza, pneumonia, and other diseases and difficulties. Half of them while they're still in training camps. So actually the training camps were actually more deadly for Americans than the battlefields of Europe. More than 200,000 were wounded. More than 200,000 were wounded. So these are still substantial numbers, just not in comparison to the nations of Europe. For example, as bad as those figures were, they really paled in comparison to the destruction in Europe. The numbers of killed and wounded in Europe would be staggering. Killed and wounded would be staggering. For example, Russia, 9 million killed and wounded. Germany, 6 million killed and wounded. 5 million in France. Germany and Italy, 2 million each. So again, very destructive in terms of its impact on these various nations. With that all said, some see World War I as kind of the ultimate progressive crusade. It's really the expansion of these ideas that galvanize this nation and sort of bring these ideals abroad. All the reform energy of the previous 20 years is turned towards winning the war, and it's ultimately successful. We are on the winning side. Federal government would play a larger role than ever in kind of managing and regulating the world economy, wartime economy, excuse me. And although much of the regulation, the kind of wartime regulation, is going to be temporary, things like rationing and such, the war experience does have lasting effects on American society. Lasting effects. I would argue that it changes the nature of government, causes people to question the role of government, the proper role of government, one might say, and enlarge the role of government. Literally, government is going to be bigger than ever before. The economy is going to be bigger than ever before. It also leads directly to the 1920s, and that's kind of where I want to go next.